The scream was the only thing that felt real. It tore from her throat, a raw animal sound that clawed its way through the stone corridors of Pembroke Castle and was swallowed by the howling January wind. Outside, the world was a frozen monochrome of gray sky and white snow. Inside, it was a hell of flickering candlelight, sweat, and blood. 13 years. She was just 13. Margaret Beaufort gripped the sheets, twisted into ropes by her small, desperate hands. The fabric was stiff with her own blood, a crimson map of her agony. Another contraction seized her, a monstrous wave that threatened to shatter her childish frame. Her hips, too narrow, her body, still caught in the borderlands between girl and woman, was being ripped asunder. The midwives murmured prayers in a Latin she barely understood, their faces, grim masks in the dancing shadows. Sancta Margarita, ora pro nobis. Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth, pray for us. But what prayer could mend a body breaking under a burden it was never meant to bear? Her dark hair, the color of wet earth, was plastered to her forehead. They thought she was dying. She felt it, a cold certainty settling in the hollows of her exhaustion. This child, this son, would be her death. And in the cruelest of ironies, he would be a king. Her life had not begun with screams, but with the scent of rain-soaked roses in the gardens of Bletsoe Castle. Born to the Duke of Somerset, she was a tiny vessel filled with the most potent and perilous substance in all of England, the royal blood of the House of Lancaster. In the savage political theater of 15th century England, such blood made you either a queen or a corpse. Her father, John Beaufort, had learned this lesson in the bitter fields of France. He returned from the war not a hero, but a ghost, haunted by the territories lost, the men dead. He withered before her eyes, his despair a palpable shroud, until one morning he was simply gone. Fever, the official account read. But whispers, insidious as poison, followed. Suicide. Disgrace. Her mother, the Dowager Duchess, wasted no time on grief. Grief was a luxury. Survival was a necessity. A woman's worth was measured in the alliances she could forge, and little Margaret, with her Lancastrian blood, was a prize. At 6, she was betrothed to John de la Pole, son of the powerful Duke of Suffolk. It was a contract, a merger of estates and influence. But politics, like the English sea, was a fickle beast. Suffolk fell from grace, his enemies circling like sharks. He was murdered while fleeing, his head crudely hacked off on the side of a boat with a rusty sword. The betrothal dissolved into worthless parchment. The next suitor came swiftly, Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. He was a man in his mid-20s, his face weathered by politics and war, his eyes holding a knowledge of the world that terrified her. The Tudors were Welsh upstarts, their legitimacy thin, but they had the one thing that mattered more than pedigree, the king's favor. They were King Henry VI half-brothers, born of his mother's secret marriage to a Welsh courtier. And so at 12 years old, Margaret stood in the chapel at Bletsoe, the cold of her grandfather's tomb seeping through the stone floor, and bound herself to this stranger. The great hall was festooned with tapestries of her ancestors' heroic deeds, a silent mockery of the powerlessness she felt. The marriage was consummated that night. There was no tenderness, no concept of waiting for a child to become a woman. She was a vessel for a dynasty, a field to be plowed for an heir. She never spoke of it, not in all her long years, but the trauma carved itself into her soul, finding its only outlet in a fierce, almost obsessive piety. God became her confidant, her shield, the only presence in a world that treated her body as a commodity. Within months, her own body betrayed her, swelling with a life she had not asked for, a change that felt more like an invasion than a miracle. The news of Edmund's death arrived on a rain-lashed November evening. A messenger, his horse lathered in sweat, found her in the chapel at Lampy Palace, praying for the husband she barely knew, who was off fighting Yorkist forces in Wales. She saw the truth in the man's exhausted eyes before he ever spoke a word. The world tilted, the stone floor seeming to fall away beneath her. Captured at Carmarthen Castle. Dead of the plague, they said. A convenient explanation that smelt of lies. At 13, she was a widow, pregnant, and utterly alone, as the storm of civil war finally broke over the kingdom. Edmund's younger brother, Jasper Tudor, took her under his protection. It was both chivalry and strategy. She carried the future of his house in her womb. He brought her to Pembroke, a grim fortress perched on the edge of the world, where the Atlantic crashed against the cliffs below. The journey was an ordeal. She traveled in a litter, each jolt of the frozen, rutted roads a fresh torment to her swollen body. Pembroke was no sanctuary. It was a cage of stone and wind. Ice frosted the inside of the windows, and the drafts were relentless, cutting through the thick tapestries that hung on the walls. Her world shrank to the size of her chambers, her days a slow march of fear and prayer. The castle's physician, a learned man named Louis Caerleon, examined her with a growing sense of dread. He spoke in low tones to Jasper, his words clinical and terrifying. Her pelvis had not finished growing. The babe was large and positioned poorly. He had seen this before. It rarely ended well. He presented Jasper with a series of horrific choices: attempt to turn the baby, which could kill them both instantly, wait and risk the child suffocating, or a cesarean birth, a procedure that was a guaranteed death sentence for the mother. As the winter deepened, something hardened within Margaret. If she was to be a pawn, she would learn the rules of the game. She devoured books on statecraft and history. Jasper, impressed by her fierce intelligence, became her tutor. He taught her to read the subtle shifts in a courtier's eyes, to hear the treachery lurking beneath diplomatic pleasantries. She learned that survival was a weapon forged from knowledge. Her piety also intensified. She would spend hours on the cold chapel floor, her knees raw, praying not for deliverance, but for strength. It was a coping mechanism, a way to reclaim a piece of herself, to build an inner fortress as formidable as Pembroke's stone walls. Suffering, she reasoned, must have a purpose. God was testing her, forging her for some great unknown destiny. The destiny arrived with a tearing pain that nearly split her in two. 18 hours she labored, her screams turning to hoarse, guttural moans as her strength gave out. The midwives, their faces slick with sweat and grim resolve, worked frantically. Dame Gwen, the head midwife, a woman with hands as tough as leather and eyes that had seen more birth and death than any soldier, used every secret of her craft. She massaged Margaret's belly, whispered ancient Welsh encouragements, and administered herbal potions that tasted of earth and desperation. Extraction. It might save the child, but it would likely kill the mother. Dame Gwen positioned Margaret, her hands slick with blood, and prayed to Saint Margaret of Antioch. She reached into the young girl's body, a violation born of necessity, to guide the baby into the world. For one terrifying moment after he emerged, there was only silence, broken by Margaret's ragged, shallow breaths. The infant was pale, limp, a blood-streaked doll. Then Dame Gwen, with a swift, practiced movement, cleared his mouth. A thin, furious wail cut through the exhausted air. Henry Tudor had arrived. Margaret, floating in a haze of pain, heard her son's cry. It was the sound of a victory she was too broken to feel. They laid him on her chest for a fleeting moment, his tiny, furious face a blur. She tried to lift a hand, to touch him, but her limbs would not obey. The physician's examination in the days that followed confirmed her body's ruin. The damage was catastrophic and permanent. She would never bear another child. At 13, her reproductive life, the primary purpose of a noblewoman, was over. That single, brutal birth had made her barren. The twist was not that she had survived, but what the survival cost, and what it created. As she hovered between life and death for weeks, racked by fever, a new resolve crystallized in her soul. This son, this one and only child torn from her body at such a price, was not just a son. He was her purpose. Her entire existence, her pain, her piety, her sharp mind, would now be honed to a single point, placing him on the throne of England. Her maternal love transmuted into something harder, colder, more dangerous, pure, unyielding ambition. The recovery was agonizing, but with it came a chilling clarity. She secured her future with another marriage, this time to Sir Henry Stafford, a younger son of the powerful Duke of Buckingham. He was a Yorkist, a man aligned with her enemies, but the marriage offered protection. It was her first truly calculated move, a sacrifice of personal conviction for her son's safety. She was no longer just Margaret Beaufort, the child widow. She was the mother of a future king, and she would play the long game. The years that followed were a masterclass in patience and deception. The Wars of the Roses consumed England, a bloody tide that swept kings up and cast them down. Margaret walked a knife's edge, maintaining a quiet, pious household with Stafford while secretly nurturing the embers of the Lancastrian cause. Her greatest heartbreak came in 1471. After the final, crushing Lancastrian defeat at Tewkesbury, her son's life was in immediate danger. He was the last best hope for their cause. Jasper made the agonizing decision to flee. 14-year-old Henry boarded a ship and sailed into a 14-year exile in Brittany. The separation was a wound that never healed. She had been separated from him by distance in Wales. Now she was separated by an ocean and the enmity of nations. The grief did not break her. It forged her into steel. Her quiet home became the nerve center of a vast intelligence network. She corresponded with exiles, cultivated allies, and moved funds through secret channels, all under the nose of the Yorkist king. Her third marriage, after Stafford's death, was her masterstroke. Thomas Stanley was the ultimate political survivor, a man whose genius lay in backing the winner at the last possible moment. Theirs was not a union of love, but of mutual ambition, a partnership of formidable minds. The climax of her life's work came not with a clash of swords, but with a calculated whisper. When King Richard III, the usurper who had likely murdered his own nephews, sat on the throne, Margaret saw her chance. She orchestrated a grand conspiracy from the shadows, a rebellion timed to coincide with her son's invasion. The first attempt failed, and she was placed under house arrest, stripped of her titles. But even in captivity, she plotted. On August 22, 1485, on a muddy field near Market Bosworth, the fate of England was decided. Richard III, fighting with the desperation of a cornered boar, charged at Henry Tudor's banner. At that crucial moment, Lord Stanley, Margaret's husband, finally showed his hand. His forces, held in reserve, crashed not into Henry's army, but into Richard's flank. It was the betrayal Margaret had spent a decade cultivating. Richard was cut down, and the crown of England was plucked from a hawthorn bush and placed upon her son's head. Far away, a message reached her. The waiting was over. After 28 years of scheming, suffering, and separation, her son was King Henry VII. In the end, she had it all. She was my lady, the king's mother. the most powerful woman in the realm, revered and respected. She saw her son marry Elizabeth of York, uniting the red rose and the white. She held her grandson, the future Henry VIII, in her arms. She had won the game. But she never regained the simple, easy love of the mother and child that had been stolen from her. Henry was a king, but he was also a stranger, a man shaped by exile, while she had been shaped by a painful, patient vigil. Standing in the grandeur of the court, amidst the silks and jewels, she could still sometimes feel the phantom agony in her hips, could still hear, faint as a whisper on the wind, the echo of a 13-year-old girl's scream, the terrible, world-changing sound of a dynasty being born.